In each of us there is another whom we do not know. He speaks to us in dreams and tells us how differently he sees us from the way we see ourselves. When, therefore, we find ourselves in a difficult situation to which there is no solution, he can sometimes kindle a light that radically alters our attitude, the very attitude that led us into the difficult situation. To Friedrich Seifert. Dear colleague, 31st of July 1935. Heartiest thanks for your kind birthday congratulations. I owe you particular thanks for your contribution to my Festschrift. I have read it already and have learnt a lot from it. It was always my view that Hegel was a psychologist monche, in much the same way as I am a philosopher monche. As to what is authentic, that seems to be decided by the spirit of the age. Or perhaps the decisive factor is the historical development of the functions. I have always expected, but whose history would have to be written by a professional philosopher. This development is a very complicated affair, since it would have to be treated not in terms of the contents that have remained more or less the same in the history of civilization, but in terms of form. Hegel seems to me a romantic thinker, in contrast to Kant, and hence a typical child of his time. And as a romantic, he is already on the way to psychology. The thinking form is not authentic any more, but is a vehicle. Your essay is a highly significant novum in the interpretation of Hegel's philosophy. I am extremely pleased that you have gone to all this trouble to contribute to my Festschrift. I would also like to thank you for sending me your fantasies, which I find extraordinarily interesting and valuable. So far I haven't had a chance to study them thoroughly, and I've only skimmed through them, but I've seen already that they are worth thorough study. In case I should come across something that seems to me particularly worth mentioning, I will write to you again. Meanwhile, with best thanks, yours sincerely, C.J. Jung. To J. Minitz. Dear colleague, 3rd of July 1939. Best thanks for kindly sending me your investigation on psychotherapy. As I see from an at present only cursory reading of your book, you give the problem of psychotherapy a central place in the discussion of modern German philosophy. This affords me the great advantage of being able to fill in the gaps in my knowledge of modern philosophy at all essential points, since I can find everything I need in your book. What Heidegger, Klages, and Jaspers have to say in this respect has never affected me very deeply, but one notices the same thing in all writers who have never had to wrestle with the practical problems of psychotherapy. They have all an astonishing facility with words, which they endow with an almost magical efficacy. If Klages had had to treat a single case of neurosis, he would never have brought off that thick tome on the obnoxious spirit. Similarly, Heidegger would have lost all desire to juggle with words. You have done the psychotherapist a favour by cutting useful footpaths through this linguistic jungle, and at every turn he can see the most curious vistas opening out before him. An especially delectable morsel is the way the philosophers juggle with death. I can't wait for the dissertation, How is Death Possible? Or the philosophical foundations of death. Excuse these heretical fits of mine. They spring from practical experience, where the impotence of philosophical language is revealed at its starkest. Without a doubt, your book meets an essential need, namely the necessity of a philosophical rapprochement with the psychotherapeutic insights that were wholly unknown to an earlier philosophy. To you, dear colleague, belongs the honour of being a pioneer in this field. It is also greatly to your credit that you do not, like the Heidegger school, merely play verbal tricks, but say something substantial. Again, with best thanks, yours sincerely, C.J. Jung. To Arnold Kernsley. Dear Herr Kernsley, 16th of March 1943. That Kierkegaard was a stimulating and pioneering force, precisely because of his neurosis, is not surprising, since he started out with a conception of God that had a peculiar Protestant bias, which he shares with a great many Protestants. To such people, his problems and his grizzling are entirely acceptable, because to them it serves the same purpose as it served him. You can then settle everything in the study and need not do it in life. Out there, things are apt to get unpleasant. I am, to be sure, a doctor, but even more than that, I am concerned with the saving good of man, for I am also a psychiatrist. I would have said to Kierkegaard straight off, it doesn't matter what you say, but what it says in you. To it you must address your answers. God is straightway with you and is the voice within you. You have to have it out with that voice. Whatever stuffing Kierkegaard had in him would then have been plain to see. A changed man, certainly, but a whole one, not a jangling hither and thither of displeasing fragmentary souls. True creative genius does not let itself be spoilt by analysis, but is freed from the impediments and distortions of a neurosis. Neurosis does not produce an art. It is uncreative and inimical to life. It is failure and bungling. But the moderns mistake morbidity for creative birth, part of the general lunacy of our time. It is, of course, an unanswerable question what an artist would have created if he had not been neurotic. Nietzsche's syphilitic infection undoubtedly exerted a strong neuroticizing influence on his life, but one could imagine a sound Nietzsche, possessed of creative power without hypertension, something like Goethe. He would have written much the same as he did, but less strident, less shrill, that is, less German, more restrained, more responsible, more reasonable and reverent. Jacob Burckhardt might have been a friend to him. Neurosis is a justified doubt in oneself and continually poses the ultimate question of trust in man and in God. Doubt is creative if it is answered by deeds, and so is neurosis if it exonerates itself as having been a phase, a crisis which is pathological only when chronic. Neurosis is a protracted crisis degenerated into a habit. The daily catastrophe ready for use. To the question whether anxiety is the subject or object of the philosophers, I can only answer anxiety can never be the object unless it is or was first the subject. In other words, anxiety as effect always has us, wherefore we say lucus a non lucendo, and euphemistically. I have anxiety. The philosopher starts from the anxiety that possesses him and then, through reflection, turns his subjective state of being possessed into a perception of anxiety. Question: is it an object worthy of anxiety or a poltroonery of the ego shitting its pants? Compare Freud. The ego is the seat of anxiety with Job 28:28. The fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. What is the anxiety of the ego? This modestly modest overweeningness and presumption of a little tin god compared with the almighty shadow of the Lord, which is the fear that fills heaven and earth. The first leads to apotropaic defensive philosophy, the second to nose deus. Would you have the time and inclination to review Walter Ehrlich's Der Mensch und die Neurosischen Regionen? Who in 1943, a philosopher who leaves the science of psychology far below him and with godlike nimbleness bestrides the rainbow bridge of hypostasis without being seized with vertigo. We empirical worms stare up at the heights, gawping. I can send you the book if you would care to do it. The review would be for the new Zeitschrift für Psychology. Not more than 3 to 4 typewritten pages. Preferably less. With best regards, yours sincerely, C.G. Jung. To Count Hermann Kaiserling, dear Count, 12th of May 1928. Now that my assistant has succeeded in deciphering your cryptogram to the point where I can think of an answer, I hasten to give you the information you want. My lecture tour in London was arranged by the new educational movement, Mrs. Beatrix Ensor in particular. So far as I remember, we shared the profits. I think it was Mortimer Hall's where I lectured. My expressioned resentment was perhaps unhappily chosen, the slovenly idiom of medical psychology. One could also say the feeling of alienation caused by your collision with the world. This is aptly characterized by your dream, arrival in the cosmic stillness, and your role as the last man. One doesn't leave what one loves, so you probably have little love for earth and man. This is called, or can be called, an indirect expression of resentment. This is the resentment I mean. By the way, the Neue Schweizer Rundschau has urged me to write an article on your spectrum, which I have done with the title The Swiss Line in the European Spectrum. I shall not fail to send you an offprint as soon as it is out. In it I have said much more than in my letter. I don't believe the last man laughs heartily, nor like a Homeric hero, but if I may say so, rather like Nietzsche. No doubt tremendously comic, no longer even a tailor to sew the last button on the last pair of trousers, sliding down the slope of the beyond on the last Saturday evening. Breakfastless and dinnerless, a gorgeous sight never to be beheld. Marvellously absurd as a fantasy. The humour of your book sounds like the laughter in your dream, which explains to me what you understand by humour. I was never forced to laugh when I read your book, or only once over the hairy clergy. Otherwise never. Nor can one laugh when reading Nietzsche. The laughter of alienation is not infectious. Always sincerely yours, C.G. Jung. To Joseph F. Reichlach. Dear Mr. Reichlach, 17th of April 1959. The philosophical influence that has prevailed in my education dates from Plato, Kant, Schopenhauer, Edwy Hartmann, and Nietzsche. These names at least characterize my main studies in philosophy. Aristotle's point of view had never particularly appealed to me, nor Hegel, who, in my very incompetent opinion, is not even a proper philosopher, but a misfired psychologist. His impossible language, which he shares with his blood brother Heidegger, denotes that his philosophy is a highly rationalized and lavishly decorated confession of his unconscious. The fact that I use the term dialectical procedure or something of this sort exposes me to the misunderstanding that I envisage an intellectual procedure, which is not the case, but in truth a practical method of dealing with the very concrete propositions the unconscious presents us with. This is a very important chapter of psychotherapy. Since neurosis consists in dissociation of personality, one is always confronted with an opposite or a vis-a-vis that you have to reckon with, a fact which is unknown only to people who know of nothing else but the contents of their consciousnesses. Moreover, the science of all moving as well as living bodies is based upon the concept of energy. Energy itself is a tension between opposites. Our psychology is no exception in the principle that embraces about the whole of natural science. In the intellectual world in which I grew up, Hegelian thought played no role at all. On the contrary, it was Kant and his epistemology on the one hand, and the other straight materialism, which I never shared, knowing too much about it, its ridiculous mythology. Hegel's dialectics, I can safely say, had no influence at all, as far as I know myself. The German term Auseinandersetzung was used to me in its colloquial sense. Being an empiricist and not a philosophical thinker, the terms I chose have their real source in experience. Thus, when I speak of Auseinandersetzung, it could be just as well the discussion between Mr. A and his wife. Another common misunderstanding is that I derive my idea of archetypes from Philo or Dionysius Areopagita or St. Augustine. It is based solely upon empirical data, viz. Upon the astonishing fact that products of the unconscious in modern individuals can almost literally coincide with symbols occurring in all peoples and at all times beyond the possibility of tradition or migration, for which I have given numerous proofs. I have never studied Hegel properly, that means his original works. There is no possibility of inferring a direct dependence, but as I said above, Hegel confesses the main trends of the unconscious and can be called uncyclo. There is, of course, a remarkable coincidence between certain tenets of Hegelian philosophy and my findings concerning the collective unconscious. Hoping that I've answered your question satisfactorily, I remain yours faithfully, C.J. Jung. To the Reverend Arthur W. Woodolph. Dear Sir, 5th of January, 1961. It would be too ambitious a task to give you a detailed account of the influence of Nietzsche's thoughts on my own development. As a matter of fact, living in the same town where Nietzsche spent his life as a professor of philosophy, I grew up in an atmosphere still vibrating from the impact of his teachings, although it was chiefly resistance which met his onslaught. I could not help being deeply impressed by his indubitable impression, Griffin-height. He was sincere, which cannot be said of so many academic teachers to whom career and vanity mean infinitely more than the truth. The fact that impressed me the most was his encounter with Zarathustra, and then his religious critique, which gives a legitimate place in philosophy to passion as the very real motive of philosophizing. The Unzeitgemsbetrachtungen were to me an eye-opener. Less so the genealogy of morals, or his idea of the eternal return of all things. His all-pervading psychological penetration has given me a deep understanding of what psychology is able to do. All in all, Nietzsche was to me the only man of that time who gave some adequate answers to certain urgent questions, which then were more felt than thought. If you have any further questions, and if their answer is within my reach, I am quite ready to cope with them. Sincerely yours, C.J. Jung, C.G. Jung. P.S. If I may call the attention of the existence of notes that have been taken of my seminars about Nietzsche's Zarathustra, they would be accessible to you in California.